Okay, so this book, Black Marxism by Cedric Robinson, that's his picture over there. I think I'll need to introduce to you the context in which this book is written. And by that I don't mean colonialism and what's being written by other, let's say, non-African American or non-people of African origin intellectuals. But I mean, in particular, the work of Eric Williams, C.L.R. James, and people like Walter Rodney. Eric Williams wrote a book in, I believe, 1944 or so, called Capitalism and Slavery. And in that book, it's one of the first books to argue the case that the Industrial Revolution of England was on the foundation and basis of the exploitation and the riches made from the slave trade. And I've read that book naturally. If you read that book, so he points out specifically, not by conjecture, but by examining the very, registers of various merchants and merchant companies, how much profit they were accruing from the slave trade, where it was going, what are the different companies that were involved in the slave trade, and how much money they were making. And so that sort of calculation really puts the whole argument in a very, very concrete manner. That it's not just about, in the sense that you can trace out very particularly, Lloyd's Bank, for example, was involved in the slave trade at this point, made this much money from it. Barclays brothers were involved with the slave trade, they made this much money from it. Liverpool, this many ships were traveling to Africa, they were taking this many slaves. On the basis of that, he does an actual computation. And when you look at those numbers, you realize that those numbers are not small. They're extraordinarily huge. The amount of money being made just from the slave trade itself is huge. And then the amount of money that's being made from the work that the slaves are doing over those 200-300 years is again really, really massive. Almost 400 years is really, really massive. And of course, the other side of the argument is that results in the underdevelopment of Africa itself. Eric Williams, who's a professor, wrote this book, and the book created a firestorm. It was incredibly successful. It was so successful, in fact, that he decided at one point in time, when he was finding things difficult in the context of his own work in the West, etc., that he was going to go back to Trinidad. He went back, he started a political movement. This work, which is a very Marxist work, became the foundation of his political movement, and he led an anti-colonial movement in Trinidad and became the president of that country. So he went from being an academic, writing on slavery, to being the figure of the Caribbean anti-colonial movement. A close friend of his who later became totally opposed to him was C.L.R. James, who also is very, very key in post-colonial studies and the like. And he was also, of course, from the Caribbean as well. So both these figures are very, very key insofar as the argument is concerned that the slave trade is crucial to the Industrial Revolution of England in a very, very concrete and real way, that the money from the slave trade became the foundation for the takeoff of England. They trace that out. And the third individual that I want to mention, of course, is Walter Rodney, who in the late 60s and early 70s, etc., when he writes his book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, again becomes a very important and major figure in the politics of the Caribbean and in the radical politics of not just the Caribbean, but of the African diaspora, as well as in Africa. So the argument, with minor differences between the three of them, or sometimes important differences as well, but the central argument that can be ascribed to these three black intellectuals is basically how the Atlantic slave trade made the base and foundation for the industrial development of England. And for that reason, of course, since they wrote these books, various authors have been trying to say, okay, no, for one reason or another, they're not entirely correct. Ye nahi theek, wo nahi theek, aise nahi theek, waise nahi theek. I have a very nice video here talking about the impact that these authors had at the time that they wrote it. Today, the argument may not seem so novel to us, but that's only because an incredible amount of work has been done by people like Eric Williams and others to demonstrate just how lucrative the slave trade was and what its impact was. Now, one very important argument made here, in addition to the fact that England benefited from the slave trade, is also that the abolition of slavery did not have to do with anything it did not have to do with any altruistic reason, but it had to do with very economic reasons of how the slave trade was perhaps no longer so profitable in the Caribbean. The transition already had to be made. Slavery itself now was too rigid a system to mesh with industrial capitalism. That's why, for instance, the North and the South America went to war with each other, the American Civil War. It's not out of, therefore, as a whole, that's not to say that individuals may not have felt sympathetic to the plight of the slaves. Of course they did. But as a whole, when we look at the process, what we discover is that the impetus to end slavery was led by and organized by interests that we could characterize as industrial capitalists, rather than by slaves themselves. There were also slave revolts in this. Slaves were also fighting against it. But on the whole, they were not really in the driving seat of this process. A few examples that one can give is that when England ended slavery, it compensated not the slaves, but it compensated the slave owners. कि अब slavery खत्म कर रहे हैं तो ये लो पैसे ले लो और इन गुलामों को आज़ाद कर दो. And so they actually had a sort of system whereby they said, these slaves are worth this many assets, so here's some money. Now you are well compensated. Another example is that during the American Civil War, the Republicans, the North promised that you would get 40 acres and a mule, and that you would be able to, be your own farmer to every black slave. And although 4 million black slaves were emancipated, but they never got that 40 acres and a mule that they were promised. As a consequence of which, they had to go back to being, wage laborers first, sharecroppers, and then wage laborers. And that obviously felt like a very strong betrayal. So for that reason, for these kinds of reasons, people like Eric Williams and others argued the case, C.L.R. James and others argued the case, that this whole idea of emancipation was basically that the West was trying to take credit for. People like William Wilberforce, etc., were trying to take credit for, that we emancipated the slaves, etc. We banned slavery. Had more to do with the economics of the shift from that kind of earlier war capitalism as described by Sven Beckett, etc., to a new kind of industrial capitalism than it had to do with the actual emancipation of these slaves. So the black people themselves just shifted from one form of oppression, which was the direct ownership of their bodies and of their persons, into another kind of oppression, which was they became wage workers, but their economic conditions did not significantly improve. So that is the context in which we're talking about. So these people, Williams, James, and Rodney, all three of them are Marxists of various sorts. And so Marxism became almost the dominant paradigm in this context of black liberation and the question of the Atlantic slave trade. And if you look at my interview that I did with Claudia de la Cruz, she also talks about how in the Deep South the Communist Party was organizing, and all these Marxists were organizing against slavery and against racism. In that early period, they are almost the only force in that area which is saying to hell with this slavery, and we want to emancipate the workers, and especially black workers, etc., etc. So in the 30s, for example, it may surprise you to discover that the Communist Party of the United States of America had enormous influence amongst black slaves, etc. इसको बंद कर दें खिड़की को, या is it okay? Should I continue? आज़ान की वजह से मैं कह रहा हूँ. क्या करें? बंद कर दें?
As you wish.
Well, I just don't want to be in violation of the Ihram-e-Azan or anything, I think that's better. Thank you. Okay. So now what Robinson wants to argue is a different case, though. He's not just arguing the case for black people being Marxists. He is, in fact, wanting them to turn away from Marxism in a certain sense towards a kind of black Marxism which will be different from, let's say, European Marxism. So what are the features of, let's say, black Marxism? Well, firstly, here's the kicker, the first major idea that he elaborates in his book. Ironically, he doesn't start his book by examining Africa like Walter Rodney or talking about great African civilizations. In fact, he starts his book by looking at Europe. You'd think a book on black Marxism would start from Africa, but it actually starts from Europe. And the argument he tries to make is that European civilization, even in the medieval period and in the ancient period, was firmly rooted in a kind of racialism. In other words, it was racist way before the beginning of the Atlantic slave trade. And the evidence he gives for this is that Greek civilization, Roman civilization was founded on slavery. Sparta was founded on slavery. The Slavs were considered an inferior people. They were considered to be slaves of, or inferior to Western Europeans, etc., or Southern Europeans. The Irish were enslaved by the English, the Welsh, the Scottish, etc. Or you can look at all of these layers and layers of different kinds of slavery that have existed in Europe's own history ever before the Atlantic slave trade ever began. And so his fundamental idea is that there is something about the way in which European civilization was structured, which made it a racist civilization, a civilization based on violence, otherization, domination, and destruction of other peoples, including other Europeans. So therefore, his argument is that capitalism does not represent a break from this system of racism and war, but merely a reframing of the same kind of pre-modern European civilization. In other words, most Marxist historians and even liberal historians would introduce a kind of break in the system. They would say, okay, they would introduce, in fact, two major breaks in European history. The first is, they say, is ancient European history, which is the Greco-Roman civilization. When Western European civilization collapses, they say after that emerges a new kind of social system, which they call feudalism. Okay, so there's ancient society or slave society based on slavery, and then a new kind of system emerges, which is called feudalism, and this is called the medieval period of European history. And then they argue a third period comes about when feudalism collapses or is destroyed by capitalism and a new kind of capitalist system comes about. And the epitome of that is the French Revolution. Okay? So Europe goes through three stages in terms of its development: an ancient, a medieval, and a modern period. The ancient period is slavery, the medieval period is feudalism, and the modern period is capitalism. But what Robinson is arguing is very different from that. He's saying, in fact, these breaks are rather arbitrary, and in fact, you can see that the same kind of racism permeates, and slavery and war and domination permeates European civilization from very early on. So, in a sense, therefore, he's trying to say that this depiction of these three stages in Europe's evolution it doesn't really exist, okay? And that what capitalism develops is something that's very much part of Europe for a very, very long time. I'll take your questions at the end, okay? Just note them down. If that is true, then what follows from this is that the working class as the universal class, which means, like for example, Karl Marx ends the Communist Manifesto by saying, workers of the world unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains, right? So if it's a world proletariat revolution, that means the proletariat is not an English class or a French class alone or a German class, but it's a class that exists or will come to exist everywhere in the world, and that all of these workers have to unite. Quite an expansive universalist kind of idea. That would be the conception of, you could call that a kind of Enlightenment universalism, if you like, or even a liberal, or the extension of a kind of liberal universalism, if you like. Some people look at it that way. You may not or may not look at it that way. But even Marx was forced to acknowledge and accept that the English working class was deeply prejudiced, at times biased, against their Irish fellow workers. There was a deep-seated sort of prejudice amongst English workers that the Irish workers are inferior. Now, to understand what is going on here, the Irish workers used to come and work in England in millions, and they would work for a lot cheaper than the British workers would work for. They were the original immigrants. Like today, you have people who say, oh, we don't want the Polish workers to come into Britain, or we don't want the Syrians or the Arabs or the Pakistanis to come because the Pakistanis work for a lot less than the British workers do, right? So back in the day, these were not Pakistani workers, these were Irish workers who were ready to work for a lot less. So British workers would say they're taking away our jobs by working at a lot less than what, than what we should be paid. So Marx therefore concluded that the British working class, after thinking about this question for a while, that the British working class should support Irish independence from Great Britain, from the United Kingdom, etc. It should support the independence movement of Ireland. And that also became, of course, that also informed, of course, the idea that the British workers should support, therefore, also the independence of India or the breakup of the colonies, etc., because Ireland was essentially a colony of the English. So this became part of the write it down, I'll take it at the end.
I just wanted to confirm, okay, why should the British working class support the Irish?
Because without that, it is not possible, according to Marx, for the British and the Irish to come together as the universal class. Without that, it is impossible, as long as Britain as a society is an imperialist society and oppressing other workers and oppressing other entire nations, then the equality of nations becomes necessary in order for various people to come together. It might be the case that the workers come together before Ireland is granted independence, and therefore, some sort of socialist federation is created or whatever. But the fact that workers of England would say that, listen, Irish workers have a right to self-determination, would remove any kind of privilege that or would put British and Irish workers on an equal footing. It would win the confidence of the Irish workers for a proletarian revolution. The same sort of solution is also, for example, given with respect to the colonial question, as I've said, but also, for example, the question of women's emancipation. That women's emancipation is both an end in itself, but also that the proletariat, which is not just men, but men and women, cannot really become a universal class as long as proletariat men continue to treat proletarian women as being inferior. So democracy within the family, democracy within the class, is an absolute prerequisite for real unity within that class. The same could also be said, for instance, for ethnic or caste differences. Like the Communist Party of India, when it was working against caste privileges, used to say that as long as you have this idea of caste privilege in your mind, you can never unite with your fellow workers, because aap unke saath, if you are not even ready to share bread with them and eat with them, then what kind of class struggle are you going to do together? If the other person is untouchable for you, what kind of class struggle are you going to do together, right? So you have to get rid of those prejudices in order to come together. But now, what Johnson is trying to explain, not Johnson, Robinson is trying to explain is that what this implies is, given how Europe has a racialist history stretching back for such a long period of time, he's saying that you cannot look at the actual concrete manifestations of all these various working class movements, and you begin to discover that there's so much still enmeshed into that history, because they've emerged from that history, that it is simply not possible for us to talk about them as a universal class. In fact, they're still very much ensconced in their national prejudices and ideas and frameworks. So, and more importantly than any racial prejudices, it's not just about, well, you have racial prejudices, but more important than that is the epistemic prejudices, he would say. So the exclusion in the historically constructed discourse, narrative about various civilizations, the exclusion within that of these aspects of history is even more important to Robinson than any overt racialist prejudice, because that goes at the epistemic level, at the level of what constitutes knowledge, what constitutes real understanding, what constitutes the truth. And if you can't agree on that, then everything else becomes kind of secondary to that fundamental idea. Now finally, what Robinson is now proposing is not only that the Negro was manufactured in Europe, the idea of this, because of course Africa is incredibly diverse, and all these people are brought together, and they put all these diverse people who speak different languages, etc. And slavery constructs, and colonialism constructs them a certain way. So before that, maybe they didn't exist that way, but now they have been turned into something because of their shared oppression. They have been given that identity. So you've been given an identity that you are X, Y, Z, and the people of that identity play ABC role in our society. By virtue of that, an identity has been constructed for them. This is not an identity that they themselves have necessarily constructed for themselves. Their own agency is not so much involved in it, but that it has been forced on them by the European colonizer. So, but within that forced construction of this identity that went with slavery is also an interesting counterpoint, which is that the Atlantic slave trade not only transferred human cargo, but it also transferred people, and those people were rooted in their culture, and when they were transferred, there's no reset button that allows you to wipe out their minds and say, all right, this is what you're going to be. You might try to impose that identity, what you think is the identity for slaves, etc. But their own identity will continuously fight against that identity. There's a dialectic going on over here, and it will and their own identity will continuously resurface from within the framework that you create for them, that you impose on them, not create for them, impose on them. So what are we saying? What this reflects is that there is an African culture that the Atlantic slave trade brought with it to the American continent. And that Africanness cannot be taken out of them, no matter what you do. Even today, if you notice, you can see that black people in the United States of America may have a different aesthetic, a different sense of music, a different sense of what constitutes beauty, what is the meaning of life, and all of these are other various things. I don't want to essentialize anyone, but I can, of course, still argue that even in the way in which they speak English, which we, for example, sometimes refer to as, what do you call it? Eubonics, or what is it called?
Sorry, I've forgotten the name, but yeah, there was like studying about it.
Eubonics, I think it's called. In the way in which language, which is the language of the Europeans, but the way in which it is used by African Americans and blacks and so on, is so different from the way in which Europeans use it. So this transfer of culture is what has been ignored or forgotten when we do just a purely political economy sort of analysis. This many people were transferred, and this much money was made, and this is where the money went, and this is where the other thing went. That's important. Nobody's saying that that's not important, naturally. But what we also want to study is how people are subjectively experiencing slavery, thinking about it. So what this also helps to explain is that when the first waves of African New World revolts came about, they were governed not only by a critique of Western society, but rather a total rejection of the experience of enslavement and racism. In a certain sense, they were not just like Marx is very carefully sifting through and dealing with and critiquing European civilization, but he's very much based in European civilization. We can't ignore that. Right? He's quoting Shakespeare and he's quoting Aristotle, and okay, maybe Aristotle not so much part of European civilization, but I fundamentally believe that he's been appropriated into what we call Europe, but we'll let that debate. But the point is, yes, Marx and Engels are very much steeped in that culture. How can they not be? They are, after all, Europeans. That's the literature they're reading. That's what they've grown up debating and talking about. So, but the African revolts are not so much interested in critiquing it and improving it and changing it and so on, but in utterly rejecting it altogether, entirely. And the entirely means not just what they did to you in terms of slavery, but the very foundation of that civilization, which would be the epistemology even. Right? So these revolts wanted, tended towards preserving a past than transforming Western society or overthrowing capitalism. They wanted to go back to Africa. They wanted to, not in the physical sense, but in the epistemic sense, in the cultural sense. And that helps us understand, or at least helps us explain, what black nationalism is, what African pride is, or black pride is, or why black consciousness has its own distinct understanding and flavor, which is quite distinct from the European, let's say, white working class movement. I don't mean white in any pejorative sense here, okay? But it has its own cultural idioms and aesthetics and so on. And where does that come from? It comes from here. All right, so finally, and I'll take your questions at the end. Finally, he argues that French surrealism plays a very interesting role in the development of this new kind of black Marxism. It serves as a bridge between Marxism and the black radical tradition. All of these thinkers were either active in the surrealist movement or expressed an interest in surrealism. So you know what surrealism is? It's kind of like above realism or beyond realism, or outside of realism, you could say. Realism, of course, is the depiction of the world as it actually exists. Surrealists explicitly called for the overthrow of bourgeois culture, identified with anti-colonial movements in Africa and Asia. Yani ki surrealists identified with these movements and turned to non-European cultures as a source of ideas and inspiration in their critique of Western civilization. So this is a movement begun by French people who are white. And they're saying, we reject the scientific rationality that we've been led to believe is objective and the most advanced way of thinking. And we want to explore and go back to, or not back to because they're Europeans, but we want to go to other sources of knowledge and information and understanding, explore maybe, voodoo and other religions and so on, Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, whatever the world has to offer, we want to explore that. And you can see that that is a very strong trend in Western civilization even today. So Aimé Césaire insists that surrealism merely brought him back to African country. Richard Wright, who began studying surrealist writings in the late 1930s, discussed its impact on his thinking in his unpublished essay titled Memories of My Grandmother. Surrealism, he claimed, helped him clarify the mystery of his grandmother and by extension the character and strengths of African American folk culture. How so? He gained a new appreciation for the metaphysical as well as for the cultural forms that do not follow the logic of Western rationality. So this is the central idea that surrealists are also questioning, and the black Marxism or black radicalism also wants to question this idea and go back to an African episteme, if you may. The mysticism prevalent in all black African philosophy presupposes a highly charged psychic world. So mysticism, what is that? I need to explain that. Mysticism is the idea that the world is spirit. It is made up of spirit, and that it may even extend to the idea that the material world is nothing but an illusion. वो जिस तरह हिंदू कहते हैं कि सब माया है. It is all an illusion. Or for example, the Islamic mysticists would say that everything is actually light, nur, the light of God. And that matter is also therefore some form of an illusion. All is God, which tends towards a pantheistic sort of idea. So mysticism is the movement away from this idea of the concrete as being the only thing that exists. Rather, it moves all the way to the other side of suggesting that the world is not necessarily rational, that the concrete may just all be an illusion, in its most extreme forms. At the end, please, okay? ये सारा मैं ब्लैक मार्क्सिज्म तो एक्सप्लेन कर रहा हूँ. All right, so आखिर में आप अपने क्वेश्चंस नोट डाउन कर लें, आखिर में मैं आपके क्वेश्चंस लूँगा ताकि फ्लो ऑफ थॉट ना इंटरप्ट हो, ठीक है? ट्राइंग अ न्यू एक्सपेरिमेंट हियर कि भाई ज़रा एक ही गो में एक दफ़ा समझाओ, फिर उसके बाद क्वेश्चंस लो. So, what is the way in which French surrealists are questioning Western rationality is very similar, he is saying, to the way in which African religions are already very much metaphysical and spiritual in their approach. The metaphysics prevalent in all black African philosophy presupposes a highly charged psychic world in which every individual agrees to forget himself or herself in order to concentrate on the least known instances of the mind's movement, a thoroughly emancipatory experience. He further asserts that in Africa, the practice of poetry was always a way of life, whereas in the West, surrealism was the product of a long philosophical and political struggle to recover what the traditional African has never lost. So, in other words, Africa and African consciousness was always very much in the realm of the mystical and the psychic. And the West is just trying to learn that now. But we already had that always. In fact, we never accepted that kind of Western rationality. And that is what differentiates, therefore, you know, the black radical tradition from Western rationality. So now to conclude, what therefore is black Marxism, according to Robinson? Firstly, the idea that European racism gave rise to slavery and capitalism, not vice versa. As I said in a previous class, I said capitalism gave rise to racism. He's saying it's the opposite. Slavery gave rise to capitalism. Racism gave rise to capitalism. Second, the idea that the universal class is a myth that cannot be created. There are far too many racial and other prejudices, etc., that go all the way to the epistemic level. And for that reason, the idea that workers of the world will unite or something is an illusion. And thirdly, the rejection of Western civilization. Not merely its critique, but its rejection altogether. That is the rejection, of course, of the foundation of Western civilization, rationality. That means the rejection of what we term Western rationality. That's not necessarily the rejection of all rationality, but the rejection of rationality as it has been understood by the West. And a move back towards the episteme, an African episteme, if you may. Okay, now I will take all your questions. Ji.
Sir, I had like 4 or 5 questions.
Great. I look forward to all of them.
Okay, so one thing that when we are talking about European racism give rise to slavery and capitalism, isn't that one already negating this idea that even the South had even the global South or East had a lot of slavery and it predates, right? So even if you argue modernity, then you are saying that Southern modernity coexists with slavery, right?
So let's pause there. Let's answer that question. It's an excellent point. So when we did the reading on Thornton, if you recall, Thornton, of course, makes the case that a slave market always existed in Africa, and what the Europeans came and did is that they accelerated it, right? They took it up and they just, it just became larger and larger and larger, right? But that it always existed. Is that historically accurate? Yes, it is. Not necessarily to the extent to which Thornton says it happens, but was there slavery outside of Europe? Of course there was. We know that the Arabs also dealt with slaves, etc. We know that various African states also were slaving states. They would conquer other people who were also African, sell them, and so on. So that is absolutely a fact. We also know that the Berbers, for example, also took Europeans as slaves. They would take Italians as slaves. So the Africans also took European slaves. The Arabs also took European slaves. So it's not just that the Europeans were taking slaves or the Europeans were making other European slaves, but that slavery was something that was present in the old world in many, many different forms and aspects in many, many different civilizations. So I do think that kind of, that's a good point to raise with Robinson. Ke wahan bhi to thi. Yes. Second question.
The thing was that when we talk about black, and this is linking back to Claudia de la Cruz's lecture as well, when we think of blackness and we think of the continent, in modern terms, blackness has come to be very much divorced from the continent. African continent and modern black culture, as we see it, at least in America, is very divorced from one another, and they they do not actually like one another as much as we like to think that they do, or this
True.
pan-Africanism doesn't really exist. So when we say that slavery brought over this culture and there's this exotic Africanism that stayed, and it did, but it mutated in a sense where I now think that there is a major break between blackness and African, right? So the African continent does not consider itself as black per se.
In the same way as...
Yes, in modern culture and whatnot. And
let me respond to that. I think that's an excellent point and entirely true. When African American people go back to Africa with some notion that they're going back to their roots, they're oftentimes quite surprised and shocked and discover themselves to be quite alien in that culture. And that is because, of course, hundreds of years have gone by. Hundreds of years of history have gone by. And that history has fundamentally changed how African Americans think about, about themselves and about the world. And one of the big differences, of course, is the language. They speak English, and a lot of the Africans may not speak English. When they speak a European language, a lot of times they may speak French, for example, on the West Coast, etc. In some places they speak English, in other places they speak other languages, etc. So there's that disconnect. So I think that's an excellent second point.
And lastly, when we talk about exoticism, this idea of African mysticism versus Western rationality, right? One, I think that very much leans into an exoticization of Southern or Eastern cultures in general. And it leans very much into this West versus East ideology, the clash of the civilizations and whatnot. And it also ignores Western mysticism. There were obviously the Celtics and the Nordics philosophy, mythology and whatnot. So it very much ignores that. And then you come to believe that only the Enlightenment, going back to your classical roots, is the form of rationality. So it's not exactly a good argument in that way.
I think that's another excellent point, Amna. That's your hat trick right there. An excellent point, because mysticism, the term itself, is actually a Western term that emerges out of many Kabbalist and Christian traditions that were Kabbalist, Jewish mysticism traditions. So to think that the West did not have an ancient mystical tradition, number one, is incorrect. And on the other hand, to think that the East or the South or whatever, these other civilizations did not have a scientific tradition is equally incorrect. Because we know from history that, in fact, many of the ideas that even the Greeks took up, they took from the Babylonians and the Egyptians. Right? That's well known by now. So when a Westerner says, oh, you guys are so exotic and mystical and religious, and we are so rational, we don't like that, right? But this is a kind of whatever definition in the same way. But the definition still remains the same, which is that the East is mystical and so on, and the West is rational, etc. And I try to nuance it a little bit by suggesting that there isn't any one kind of rationality, that you can have a Western and an East rationality and something else. But again, that's I say that because I'm I'm representing the argument, but I myself find that somewhat hard to believe, because if that was the case, then it couldn't have been that these ideas could have traveled across the world in the way that they did and cross-fertilized in the way that they did. With people reading each other from different civilizations and saying, Pythagoras makes an interesting point about the hypotenuse or whatever, right? So, another excellent point. Did you have a fourth point?
No, I think
that's it? Okay, great. G.
I just want to gain clarity on this thing when you said that like the Irish workers
Yeah.
were working for way lesser than the British workers.
Yes.
And at that time, it started the movement started. The Irish people should get independence, and like in the same way, other colonies should also get independence.
Right.
When you were talking about that, you mentioned something like you said that even let's say people of the same caste, but they're different castes but the same class, till the point they don't come together, they cannot create a movement. I just want to gain a clarity on this, that were the British workers trying to glorify the independence of Irish workers just for their own motives, that okay, हमें अब काम नहीं मिल रहा, we are not getting work at the same rate that we were giving, because Irish workers do it at comparatively lesser one. Were they trying to glorify it and just in a ulterior motive different, or was it really the case that they wanted everyone to be equal?
Well, when we talk about British workers, we have to think that we're talking about those who were with Karl Marx and following his ideas. not the whole British working class was not following Karl Marx. So when the Marxist movement began to say that the British workers ought to support the self-determination of Ireland, the central idea behind that is that that was necessary in order to bring about real and fundamental working class unity. That unity would not be possible as long as the British held on to their privilege as a great empire, right? So it was the self-destruction of your privilege in order to gain something bigger, which was a new world together with everybody else.
Actually, the reason that this popped in my head was when we were earlier, before this point, we were talking about how slave trade became a little less profitable for, Europeans, and then they started to like, oh, we can end it and let's just go towards wage labor thing and glorifying it in the process. So I just wanted to gain a clarity that was it the same thing with the independence period as well? Like John said.
No, I don't think it's the thing is equivalent, because here you had, well, for several reasons. Number one, in that particular instance, you had a situation where you were really transferring from one kind of capitalism to another kind of capitalism. And that was being presented in a way which led to people having the idea that now they would be not only free of slavery, but they would be free of the poverty that came with that. And that didn't happen. In this particular instance, what we're talking about is a movement that argues the case for the end of capitalism itself, and the end of all class exploitation. Whether you accept that point of view or not, that is its claim for itself, for its own self. So for that reason, I think the two are not necessarily so close to each other. But another excellent question.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much. I just wanted to ask, I completely agree with the fact that blackness means something different from the black community in America than what blackness is for the black community in Africa, because even the Americans, the black Americans don't want to be referred as African Americans, and they prefer being referred as black. So
some of them.
Yes.
Not all of them.
So most of them that I have come across, they're just like, they take it as an offense if you call them African American. But they would be like, I mean, if they're like after like the entire war and like being a citizen of the country, so like being referred to as black would be more preferable. But yes,
there's a diversity of views there.
Yeah, that's still up for debate. But secondly, I wanted to ask, like, even with the theme of mysticism, and when we talk about African mysticism or Eastern mysticism, does that not bring like the layer of exoticism in itself? Because once you like talk about African mysticism or Eastern mysticism, that it does bring in the concept of us or them, us versus them. So that really leads to the othering. So I just wanted to like.
Well, it is an othering in this sense that it is a kind of essentializing difference between Europeans and Africans. The kind of politics, of course, it leads to is black radicalism, which wants to break with, let's say, the white working class or the white socialist tradition or the white Marxist tradition. In a certain sense, it's very similar to what happened with the feminist movement, when the feminist movement spoke for all women, etc. And then black feminism arose, and they said, well, actually, your demands are not the same as my demands. Our demands are very different because we're black. So the rise of this black radical tradition broke with these other sort of movements that were arguing the case for a universal, for a cross-race unity. Marxism being one of them, liberalism is another one of them. Okay? So what is the final politics of Cedric Robinson? I would say you could call it, well, you could obviously call it black radicalism. You could also call it black nationalism. You could also call it, as I put over here in one of the slides, Africanism or Africanist, right? So yeah, it is a different. It's not Marxist politics, that's for sure. It's very different, but it is taking something from that tradition, but not everything. And you can see that at the time this book is written, this is written in the 1980s. Later on you will see how, well, this book is maybe not as key, but it's one of the key books and one of the key sort of texts amongst many that then later leads away from that kind of class politics of the Communist Party of USA, which is saying black and white unite against capitalism, to the kind of black nationalist politics, which is saying you do your own stuff, we'll do our own thing, and that's what we want to do. We don't want to come together in one big organization. So what we sometimes refer to pejoratively as identity politics, right?
Sorry, I had another question.
Please, go ahead.
So the author Robinson talked about universal proletariat. So, I mean, where he was talking about the Welsh and the English, and now we celebrate, like, we have trade unions all across the globe, and then we have Labour's Day, and we try to bring all the working class on one, like, on a single wavelength. But do you think that idea is, like, still very flawed in the sense that you still have Brexit, examples like that, and then you have still, like, I mean, when you talked about feminism, and that there comes with a lot of other layers, for example, like the feminism for a white woman would be very different, for like the kind of struggles that she would come across would be very different from the kind of struggles that a brown woman comes across, or like a black woman comes across. So do you think, like, in that, keeping in mind those, like, features and those aspects, do you think that the universal proletariat is still going to be a myth despite the lot of factors that are trying to, like, make it the case? Because there are a lot of examples.
Look, so if by the universal proletariat we mean that all the workers of the world will have identical problems, that's, of course, can't be true. Or that they'll have, an identical culture, that will not be true. Can never be true, right? Or that somehow the articulation of their hopes and desires will be, identical. All of that is obviously so absurd, such that nobody would ever assert it even. The idea, therefore, of the universal class is that the fundamental economic interests of the working class align across nationalities. That's the idea. That does not mean everything they think or say or do or whatever aligns. It does not. On that too, only insofar as the precondition for their emancipation is the destruction of capitalism. In that sense alone are they a universal class. But in any other sense, if you take that, if you extend that argument, it will completely fall apart. So that's the sense in which Marx meant it. And he was taking this idea of the universal class really from a Hegelian framework, right? And he said this is the universal class because it's universally oppressed and destroyed and pulverized and exploited, and that more and more it is brought together in this global supply chain of production, and it will come to recognize its own power as uniting people in this unity. So if I am sitting here in Pakistan and I am producing shoes for Adidas, and somebody else is sitting in Vietnam and somebody else is sitting there, etc., we're on the same supply chain. When you recognize that you're on the same supply chain, then any change that you bring about, let's say an Adidas company policy, will have the same impact in Vietnam as it does in Bangladesh, as it does in Pakistan. So to give you one example, Coca-Cola ka union hai Lahore mein. Coca-Cola bottlers jo hai, they have a union. I can bring them in sometime, you can talk to them. And I in fact said we should do a Coca-Cola union studio. Coke studio nahi, Coca-Cola union studio, right? Now that union is called the food and the overarching union in that Pakistani Coca-Cola Employees Union is called the Food and Beverage Employees Union. And that is a global union. And when they argue, when they fight against Coca-Cola, people in various parts of the world can simultaneously, these unions can go on strike or can do a slowdown or can do a protest or whatever. And of course the Pakistani union is the Pakistani union and the one in Bangladesh is the one in Bangladesh, but they coordinate. And they say to put pressure on the management, we are going to coordinate and we're going to do this together. And that will be a stronger force, and that's how we're going to change company policy towards workers. So in a smaller sense, you see that how that operates. Now when you take that in an even bigger sense, that the whole world is being globalized into this one massive supply and consumption chain, then you begin to see that what Marx's argument is. It's not a culturalist argument. It is a political economy argument, that their fundamental political economic interests coincide. But does their culture coincide? Absolutely not. Nowhere has he made that argument.
I just have one last.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's about how the author talks about how racism gave rise to capitalism, but I don't think that they're mutually exclusive, because if one could cause the other. For example, capitalism could also give rise to racism. And I mean, if you see like a couple of white guys who've been rich, and then obviously they like employ people, and then not, even if like today's dynamics that you see, like capitalism does give rise to racism because like the white countries, the European countries, the West countries are rich, and then I mean the IMF comes into play, and then a lot of other like multinational organizations, and then the headquarters of every like Amazon, Netflix, like these Google, big countries in New York, and these in Western countries which are predominantly white. So capitalism in turn also causes racism, and racism does cause capitalism too. So it can't be mutually exclusive, it's vice versa.
Yeah, I don't think he's at all arguing that they're mutually exclusive, but he's saying what's causing what, right? So what comes before? So just
eggs and chicken or the egg?
the chicken or the egg. But I mean, purely chronologically, of course, racism has existed before capitalism. There's no doubt about that, right? Racialist ideas have existed before capitalism. But I think the argument, of course, by people like Eric Williams or others, etc., is that the way in which the Atlantic slave trade, which was itself the starting point of capitalism, enslaved millions of people, African people, just expanded it on a scale that it had never existed in the previous period of history. That's, I think, the central point. Not that slavery did not exist before or racism did not exist before. It did, certainly did. But the peculiar manifestation of it in the Atlantic slave trade is ironically, for Marxists, it's ironically driven by capitalism. Why is this relevant? It's relevant because the other side, the liberals and the neoliberals, have been saying the market is the great equalizer. Because in the market, it doesn't matter what the color of your skin is or what your gender is. You come into the market with a commodity, and as equals, we exchange that commodity. You buy what is of utility to you, I buy what is of utility to me. So when you study economics, you don't find any racism in that economics because it's all demand and supply and the rest of it, right? It's all this abstract level at which people are operating or whatever the case is, right? So the fundamental idea, of course, that was not really elaborated by the classical liberals, because the classical liberals themselves were pretty racist. Okay, but it did form part of the universalist idea of liberalism, even when the liberals themselves could be racist. Is negated here by the Marxists, who argue that in fact the market operated historically in a way, and this is not a reductionist argument, historically it operated in a way that generated more racism and expanded it, and just kind of resulted in the today's perception of black or African American people as being worthy of nothing else but this kind of derogatory, horrible, oppressive condition. So that's, I think, the point. Yeah, actually, the criticism of it is a criticism of the idea that the market is the great leveler, because in the market, all that matters is the product you bring to the market. That's the criticism that, is coming from this side. But the criticism of that criticism is, well, it always existed. But as Amna pointed out, yes, it always existed, but it didn't always only exist in the West. It always also existed in other parts of the world.
So it's interesting. Arabs are discriminated against, but they discriminate against others.
Sure, because in their own society, they are the rulers. What about us? Okay, I criticize the Arabs. Well, what about us? The number one beauty product, and the number one reason, I'm sorry to have to tell you this, that women go to beauty parlors is to become more white. If you don't know this is the sad truth. And the number one product that sells in the market is creams that make you more white. So is that the standard of beauty now? Yes.
Yeah, Professor. So as Claudia de la Cruz in her lecture, said that Marxism is against class struggle and fragmentation. It cannot be remixed, right? And in Robinson's reading, we also, you told about the English working class struggle, which was again about the hierarchy and the people who were getting exploited, the Irish people, right? So does Black Marxism talk about exploitation in general against all races globally, or does it only focus on Black Marxism?
No, it is focused on the question of black liberation. That's why it's black Marxism or the black radical tradition.
And is it like important to call it like black Marxism again? Can it not be just Marxism because it is talking about universal idea?
No, for the reasons that I elaborated, it's not Marxism of the same kind. So it's a black radical tradition emerging from Marxism, because the main authors were originally Marxists, as he contends, and then later on became black radicals. You can contest that, but that's the idea. Okay? It emerges from Marxism, but takes a detour into, to put it very simply, into what we today call identity politics. So when Jordan Peterson or somebody says these cultural Marxists, right? You've heard that expression?
Yeah.
The alt-right often says these cultural Marxists. So who are these cultural Marxists that he's talking about? It's people who, what were the non-cultural Marxists? The non-cultural Marxists, the older Marxists, etc. The older tradition is about, well, we want to bring everybody who is united on this economic question together. Whether you're black or you're white or you're male or you're female or you're whatever, X, Y, Z, whatever, let's all come together. We are the 99% and we are going to break this capitalist system. Right? So it's about class solidarity, say. Whereas the new politics, of course, is about other identities, not just class. It can be about class, but about other identities, being a woman or your sexuality or your race, ethnicity, nationality, etc., etc. So that's what's referred to, this is what's being referred to as cultural Marxism. Now, why is it called cultural Marxism? Not because it is Marxism, but because it did emerge from the Marxist tradition. That's why it's referred to as cultural Marxism. Okay? And here we have one instance of what the alt-right would call cultural Marxism, which is the tradition of black Marxism. Yes?
But isn't black Marxism kind of exclusionary because it goes against the idea of like black is a politic as opposed to black Marxism or black radical?
Right. So Claudia, of course, is a Marxist. She's not a black Marxist. She's a black person who identifies with black politics, but she is a Marxist, right? Which is why she was criticizing the idea of black Marxism. She was saying there's a Marxism, there's no black Marxism, and there's no Pakistani Marxism. There may be the articulation of Marxism in the cultural idiom of your own countries and all of that. But, at the epistemic and methodological level, you can't really distinguish between them.